the goal is to have everyone link their biometric digital ID first to a social media account. And we've had people like Elon Musk promote this even before he bought Twitter, saying we need to authenticate all real humans, that use the platform to resolve the quote-unquote bot problem on Twitter, which obviously it's there, but what he doesn't really say is that a lot of those bots are run by militaries, including the U.S. military, which he contracts for example. But yeah, it's a pretty extensive issue.
In an interview with the Corbett Report, investigative journalist Whitney Webb details what's really happening with the digital ID, how they plan to implement it, who's behind it, and where she sees this all going. According to Whitney, she shared that the digital ID is not a left versus right issue. In fact, she stated that she believes it's the government in general. It's just how it's framed to each respective side's fears. If you're on the right, they are framing it as digital ID is the answer to illegal immigration. If you're on the left, they are framing it as the way to clean up the hate speech online. However, ultimately, all roads lead to the same result: severely limiting your freedom. Whitney believes social media will play a big role in issuing the digital ID. Whitney expressed that your digital ID will allow you to use the internet, and it will be able to track your every move. Whitney went on to share where she sees this whole thing going. Let's listen to what Whitney has to say.
So ultimately, a lot of this, repursing that we just talked about, yeah, I think ultimately the goal is to herd people into manufacturing consent for some sort of digital ID system, with the goal of having that system being connected to all of your internet access through your internet service provider or ISP, and also to your social media account, with the goal of really having you have a formal government ID linked profile of everything you read and consume online, as a way to get around repersoning and the bot issue and all of these things. So who's behind this larger agenda? Well, it's not just one person. It's not just two people. It's a lot bigger than that. All of these global policy agendas that are somehow being implemented in lockstep globally obviously have a transnational group behind them. I think that's quite clear. And there's no shortage of cheerleaders for that agenda in the United States, whether it's team left or team right. And the same is true elsewhere. It's just really the sales pitches to get people to adopt them are different. So, on the right, it's being framed as a way to stop illegal immigration. On the left, it's being framed as a way to stop hate speech and stop cyberbullying online and protect children and all sorts of things like that, really just looking for whatever metric sticks with whatever demographic they want to placate ultimately. So there's several groups that are behind it. A lot of it ultimately goes back, if you look at, some of these entities that sort of first kickstart the digital ID push under the auspices of the United Nations, like the ID 2020 Alliance, which has now been folded into another alliance with essentially all of the same funders. But ultimately, ID 2020 was started by, groups like Microsoft, the Rockefeller Foundation, Accenture, some of these big multinational corporations, or in the case of the Rockefeller Foundation, the philanthropic arms of oligarchic clans that have tried to create a global system of financial control in private hands for the better part of the last 100 years. And so ultimately, digital ID is meant to sort of facilitate that kind of system globally. But I don't think it's likely that they're going to sell it as one universal digital ID for everybody. They want it to be vendor agnostic, but have it all have sort of similar standards and have the data all be exportable in the same format. So, maybe you'll have in the US, for example, 5 or 6 or even 10 different vendors of digital ID. And Japan will have 5 to 10 and what have you. But ultimately, all of that data, whether the US, Japan, or anywhere else in the world, can all be exported in the same format to the same centralized database, which is ultimately the goal, right? And then technically you do have a centralized system of digital ID, but it looks to be decentralized at the superficial layer. And that is also the goal too with the digital currency push. And because it's not just central bank digital currencies, there's also the issue of private bank digital currencies, which are also just as surveillable and seizable and programmable as CBDCs would be. They're just in the hands of private banks. And do you think JP Morgan would behave any better than the Federal Reserve when JP Morgan is one of the biggest, controllers of the Federal Reserve? I mean, honestly, it's kind of a false dichotomy at the end of the day. You can get that kind of liberty killing money from either the private or the public sector. And what will likely happen is a public-private partnership, the preferred model of all of these groups, UN included. And so I think ultimately that's where this is going to lead us. And they want it to obviously be connected to your online activity. So if you want to use the internet for economic activity, for social activity, or education, or anything else, you will have to have a digital ID and connect it to, your ability to get online. And then obviously there's a push to have, turn basically social media giants into banks. There's a big push for this with X, Twitter, and presumably, it was Facebook originally that tried to start the stablecoin Libra Diem project that has since, been turned into, after it was shut down, went to populate USDC and some of these companies that are working on the Lightning Network on Bitcoin, like David Marcus's Lightspark and some of those things. So there's efforts to revive that and ultimately kind of link it to some sort of gig economy, I guess you could say, based on how much of people's attention you can get on these social media platforms and, what your metrics are in terms of likes and clicks. But are you even dealing with real people? Are you even, presumably you would be, right, if everyone has an ID, but that's not necessarily true when you consider that a lot of governments are the people running the bots right now. It's pretty much an admitted thing that militaries around the world own and control bot farms. They use them for narrative management. In the case of the U.S. military, the Air Force specifically started researching how to use social media to control people like drones. That's literally what they say in 2014. And now you have a Pentagon contractor, running Twitter and X. I mean, do you think that Elon Musk would demand that the Pentagon's bot farm, when he works for the Pentagon, that they all register and have their stuff online? But it will create that perception that there are no bots. These are all real, authentic people.
Exactly.
And I think that's ultimately the goal.
Whitney expressed concern over the digital ID. But in addition to the digital ID, the powers that be having the ability to link your financial ability to your digital ID and/or your social media accounts. In this next clip, Whitney explains where she sees this all going and what we can all expect in the future. Let's listen to what Whitney has to say.
Ultimately, where I see this going is really where I see the powers that be, how they plan to use AI and what they plan to do to humanity with it. So I guess about a year ago, or maybe a little, I can't remember the exact date, but I wrote a piece for Catherine Austin Fitz's Solari report, which was basically a summary of what some of the architects of artificial intelligence, at least in the United States, see as what the real promise of AI is and where it will take us and what they anticipate will happen. And so I looked at this book by Eric Schmidt and Henry Kissinger called The Age of AI, Our Human Future. One of the reasons I did that is because Eric Schmidt was the lead of the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence. He has styled himself as Kissinger's heir and did this before Kissinger died. And ultimately, has basically created the roadmap that the U.S. national security state will use in guiding its implementation of artificial intelligence. So this is someone who's very important to listen to. He's also on the steering committee of Bilderberg alongside Peter Thiel, the anti-Schmidt, supposedly, but who's definitely on board for all of this stuff as well, despite his slightly different rhetoric and obviously a very different, well-oiled PR machine that makes him appear to be something that he is not. So in that book, basically, and I think this is very revealing, Kissinger and Schmidt essentially say that the real promise of AI, it's not in making life more convenient and all of this stuff that us plebs are told. The real promise is that it will forever alter how humanity perceives and processes reality. And so there's a lot of implications for that. on social media and on the internet in general. And in talking about, the flow of information in AI, they essentially say that the content is going to be produced mostly by AI, and then AI will censor the content as well. So even if you're in this sort of paradigm where you have a digital ID and you're on the internet and you think you're dealing only with real people and real bots, you're still going to be essentially living in an AI soup. And so the AI, censor bot will probably be censoring real people and not the AI slop. But the goal is ultimately to have it be about perception management, and ultimately the kind of world they envision is one where people depend on AI to tell them what is real and what is not. And that this is really the only way to deal with AI-powered misinformation. And honestly, it makes no sense. It's basically like AI is creating this problem, and so the solution is to essentially put AI in charge of everything and have it be sort of the processor of reality for us. And they also make these other arguments that as humans become more and more dependent on AI, including for perceiving reality, humans will lose the ability to do it themselves, and will sort of be in this place where they have to use AI to understand what's going on, and and that humanity as a consequence will just become so easily manipulated to really unprecedented degrees. And when you consider all the profiling that's happened on people based on their online activity over the last 20 years, if you don't think they know how to manipulate you, they absolutely do.